Hello and welcome to EconVersations. I'm your host, Dr. Dan Sutter of the Johnson Center for Political Economy at Troy University. Money plays an almost inconceivably important role in our personal lives and in enabling our modern economy. Without the insurance that people would be able to easily exchange with others across the country or globe, the extent of our economic system would be tremendously diminished, and our lives would be tremendously poorer. What are the origins of money in economic history, and why is this important for monetary policy today? Joining me on EconVersations today to talk about these issues is Dr. William Luther, an economist with Kenyon College in Ohio. Dr. Luther has published scholarly papers on both the monetary history and contemporary monetary policy issues, including new cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin. Will, welcome to the show.
Pleasure to be here.
Well, money plays this important role in our economy, and sometimes we don't realize how important money is until it breaks down. And one of the most spectacular breakdowns of money in a modern economy occurs with something that's known as hyperinflation, which is an extreme version of what economists refer to as inflation. But before we get to some cases of hyperinflation, could you tell our viewers what exactly we mean by inflation and then what constitutes a hyperinflation?
Sure. Well, inflation just refers to a gradual increase in prices from one year to the next. So in the U.S., for example, inflation at the moment is around 2%. And so what that means is that over time, if you're holding money, it's worth a little less over time. And so at 2%, that effectively means that if you're holding a dollar at the beginning of the year, then at the end of the year, that dollar really only buys about 98 cents worth of valuable goods and services. On the other hand, you can think about it over a monthly period. And so if you're holding a dollar at the beginning of the month, at the end of the month, it really only buys, well, about 99.9% of what it would have bought at the beginning of the month. So effectively a dollar.
So then what do we refer to by hyperinflation?
So hyperinflation refers to a case where the monthly inflation rate is at least 50%. And so recall that the U.S. annual inflation rate is around 2%. And so now we're talking about a case where the monthly inflation rate is over 50%. And so that's quite a big difference. If we just think about how quickly prices are doubling, in the U.S. at 2%, prices double about every 35 years. But that lower bar of hyperinflation, 50%, that means prices are doubling well around every 42 days. And so it's a very big difference in inflation.
Now, probably the most famous example of hyperinflation in economic history goes back to Germany between World War I and World War II in Weimar, Germany. They had a wild case of hyperinflation, which historically is very important because it was one of the things that helped destabilize the Weimar Republic. So tell us a little bit about the hyperinflation that they had there.
Sure. Well, the hyperinflation of the Weimar Republic took place between June 1921 and January of 1924. And what was happening at the time, so the Weimar Republic, what today we know as Germany, needed to pay reparations following World War I. Germany had suspended the convertibility of their currency into gold when the war broke out, and the reparations needed to be paid in hard currency. And so what Germany did was print its own currency in order to purchase foreign currencies which were still convertible into gold. The thing is that as you print more and more of your currency, it's worth less and less. And so Germany had to print more and more and more in order to acquire enough of these foreign currencies to continue making its reparations payments, and hyperinflation resulted.
And so we can see here it was really up in like the millions of percent inflation.
So the hyperinflation really peaked in October of 1923. The monthly inflation rate during that period was 29,500%, and so that meant that prices were doubling about every 3 to 4 days.
And here's just some of the images from that time. I mean, people had to carry baskets of marks around to try to go shopping, right?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, at this point, the paper notes are worth about what the paper and ink to print them on is worth. So that's really an astounding case.
So when money's worth that, though, you can do stuff like use it for wallpaper, or
that's right.
Let children play with it, blocks, or even burn it in the a furnace because it was cheaper than wood, right?
Yeah, it's really astounding.
So although that's probably the most famous example of a hyperinflation, sadly it's not the only example of hyperinflations that we've had in history, right?
That's right. So Hungary was probably the worst case of hyperinflation in history, and in July 1946, the daily inflation rate exceeded 200%, and so that meant that prices were doubling around every 15 hours. So really just astounding. More recently than that, Zimbabwe experienced some pretty serious inflation, and in November 2008 in Zimbabwe, prices were doubling just a little less than once per day, and so a very troubling case there as well.
So when inflation hits this kind of level, when money really, the currency of the country really sort of stops operating, right? And so we can really see by what happens in a country when they're gripped by hyperinflation, how important money is. So what are some of the things that happen?
We can think about two broad categories of things that happen during a hyperinflation. The first thing is that since the money is losing its value so quickly, people are reluctant to hold money. They want to get rid of it as quickly as they can. Money becomes sort of a hot potato, and so once you're paid in cash, you want to exchange that for either some goods that will retain their value or some other money that's not being devalued so quickly. And so, not surprisingly, a lot of people in the economy begin providing this service to others of exchanging currencies, perhaps for commodities or for other currencies. And so what that means is that if those individuals are in the streets exchanging currencies, they're not in the firms and factories producing other valuable goods and services. And so that alone means we're going to be underproducing as an economy. But of course, as hyperinflation picks up and as prices are changing so rapidly, it becomes very uncertain what prices should be. If prices are doubling every day, then you have to be constantly changing prices, and maybe you're changing prices faster or more slowly than other companies are. And so that uncertainty just causes some people to say, I can't work in this environment. And so production stops for those reasons as well. The difficulty of calculating, engaging in economic calculation when prices are changing so rapidly is just unbearable. And so as a result, these economies, they just produce much less than they are capable of.
Our division of labor economy breaks down when people can't exchange, right?
Exactly. So the division of labor contracts, engage in a lot of home production, and people are poorer and live much more difficult lives than they need to.
Another thing that sometimes happens in some of the countries experiencing hyperinflation is that you'll see people start to use outside currencies. Like say, I think in Peru, the dollar would start to circulate in place of the local currency, right?
That's right. In some places this is illegal, and it still happens despite it being illegal because you're looking at a bunch of very bad alternatives, and sometimes facing some punishments isn't the worst alternative.
Right.
And so in places like Zimbabwe, for example, they started turning to hard commodities like gold and also to the U.S. dollar. Eventually, Zimbabwe legalized use of the U.S. dollar, and so you wouldn't face punishments for using that outside currency. But yeah, individuals seeing that the currency that they've been using it doesn't function as well as it had in the past, and as well as alternative currencies are, sometimes they'll switch to some other currency or commodity to use in exchange.
So what we're actually seeing in these cases is like a new type of money emerge in these economies to replace the broken down one that's become worthless due to hyperinflation, right?
That's right, and so it could be a new type of money in the sense of that money hasn't been used in this area before, like the dollar being adopted in a place like Zimbabwe, or it could be a new type of money in the sense that this item hasn't served as a medium of exchange or a money anywhere, but now that we don't have access to this alternative to our existing money, we turn to some new alternative.
And this might strike us as very odd today in our economy, since we're so used to having government monies that are so relatively stable. But in history, we've certainly seen a lot of other things other than, like, say, dollars or pounds in Britain serve as money prior to the emergence of today's modern monies, right?
Yeah, so if you, one of the reasons why we use money is because our trading partners are using that money. And so for a lot of us living in the U.S., the idea of even making a choice over currency seems a bit odd. There's really no choice to make. Everyone is using dollars, and so if you want to engage in trade with those other people, then you have to use dollars as well, or else it would just be very cumbersome to transact. And so these peculiar cases kind of remind us that, in fact, over some margins, there is a very important decision about what currency to use.
So we've seen, like, a number of different things in economic history that look to have served as money.
Yeah.
Certainly gold and silver, the precious metals, and other types of what we call commodity monies. But to be sure that they're actually serving as monies, I mean, when you're looking across times, across cultures, I mean, it helps from an economic standpoint to sort of know, well, what do we really mean by are the roles or uses of money in an economy? So economists have focused on, I think, one main and I guess two other roles that we can look to and say, money does these certain functions in a society. What are those?
Yeah, so monetary economists define money as a commonly accepted medium of exchange. There are two aspects there. The first is that it's a medium of exchange. And so it's an item that you'll accept not because you want to consume this item, but because you reasonably expect that you'll be able to trade that item for some other good or service that you want at some point in the future. And so there the item is functioning as a medium of exchange. It's a medium through which you can exchange for goods and services that you want. The other important aspect there is that it's commonly accepted, right? And so lots of items might function as a medium of exchange, but a money is an item that lots of people are employing as a medium of exchange.
So it's not really barter in that you're not exchanging one item that you want for another, you're exchanging for something else that you can exchange.
Right, barter is quite cumbersome, right? Because you have to find someone who has what you want and wants what you have. And so that's why we use a medium of exchange. So perhaps you have what I want, but I don't have what you want, and so we'll make a trade, and you can then trade that item that you've received in some later trade. And so that item will function as a medium of exchange. Of course, in order to function as a medium of exchange, the item has to be an asset. It has to have some value. And so another function that we think about when we think about monies is its role as a store of value. Some monies are reasonably good at storing value. I mentioned that the U.S. dollar, inflation, dollar inflation is only 2% a year, and so that's a fair store of value. And so a lot of individuals in developing countries that don't have access to a domestic currency that's a reasonable store of value will use dollars as a store of value. And so that's something that we tend to associate with monies as well.
And that's one area where inflation really ends up being costly, is in the store of value.
Yeah, if you're holding a money and prices denominated in that money are increasing significantly, then it's a lot like someone confiscating a portion of your money. Your money just doesn't buy as many goods and services as it would have in the past.
And then finally,
yeah, the third thing that most monies do. Right, if you're using an item as a medium of exchange and you're holding some fraction of your wealth in that item as a store of value, then oftentimes that item will often be used to quote prices in. So we say that it's a unit of account. And so we price goods and services in this money. We do all of our accounting in that money, and so the money can function as a unit of account as well.
And that's really very important for us as functioning as just as consumers in a modern economy. We can say something like, this costs $15, and we automatically, very quickly, have a good sense of what that means, right?
Right. Economists, we say that prices reflect relative scarcity, and so it tells us how much an item is valued given how much of it there is. And if we didn't have prices, it would be very cumbersome to talk about that relative scarcity. We'd be trying to figure out how many apples we have relative to bananas and cars and everything. And in a modern economy, the set of goods is so large that it's really difficult to even think about how we would express those relative values. If you have something like dollars, though, a common measure that everyone is relatively familiar with, now you can start having an understanding about the relative scarcity of, say, apples to bananas without even talking about apples and bananas. You just say the price of apples is, say 50 cents, and the price of a banana is 75 cents. And so that relative scarcity is really built in there, and we don't have to discuss it in such a complicated way.
Now, today, I mean, in the U.S. we have the dollar, and this is what's known as a fiat currency, right, or a fiat money, and it's also been created by our government. And so what are these government monies that we have today, and how are they different?
So at least traditionally, economists have distinguished between commodity monies and fiat monies. And so a commodity money is a money that is an item, a good perhaps, that has some use apart from its role as a medium of exchange. And so if you think about gold or silver or salt, these commodities have some use aside from their usefulness in transacting. But our modern fiat monies are very different in that respect. So first, the very name fiat means by decree, and so not surprisingly, we've given this type of money this name because they're almost exclusively introduced by governments. But a fiat money, unlike a commodity money, doesn't have some non-monetary value. Effectively, its only use is to be used as a medium of exchange. And so with dollars, we can make payments with dollars, but if no one were accepting dollars, what else would you do with them? You might, wallpaper your house with them, or give them to your kids to play with, like we saw in the case of the paper marks in the Weimar Republic, but those are uses much lower than the monetary value that those notes command today.
So monetary economists have gone back in history and tried to explore what the source, the origins of money in an economy are. And there's two main schools of thought about the origins of money. So tell us a little bit about, Tell us a little bit about these two different schools of thought.
Sure. Well, so one of these schools of thought is the what we might call the state theory of money, and it was pioneered by George Knapp and later expounded on by Abba Lerner. And the idea there is relatively simple. It's whatever is money because the government said that's what we're going to use as money. And so the government says we're going to use dollars, and so everyone uses dollars. And there are a couple ways that more sophisticated versions of this theory has been presented. So perhaps it's because the government declares a money legal tender. That is, for debt contracts, courts will enforce contracts that are denominated in a particular money, or they'll settle contracts in a particular money, and that might encourage people to accept them. Or the other explanation is that if the government accepts taxes in a particular money and commits to making its payments in a particular money, then that encourages other people to use that money as well. And so Knapp and Lerner took kind of a strong view of the state theory of money and basically concluded that whatever the government said was going to function as money would function as money.
But there's a contrasting view from some economists who argue that money is sort of emerged on its own.
That's right. So Abba Lerner says that money is a creature of the state, but Carl Menger argued that at least commodity monies emerged quite naturally out of barter relationships. And so if it's very difficult for us to exchange good for goods, either because, or presumably because it's very difficult to find someone who has what you want and wants what you have, what William Stanley Jevons called the double coincidence of wants problem, then we might accept something in the interim that we can then trade later. And if there are some costs associated with assessing these media of exchange, or if some of these items are more desirable as media of exchange than others, then we have a tendency to converge on a commonly accepted medium of exchange, or at the very least a few commonly accepted media of exchange. And so from that view, out of our barter relationships, money emerges from those relationships.
And this is, well, it might sound not as significant on the surface. It really is a very different way of thinking about how a very useful and important institution in our economy came into existence, right? Whether it was directed and sort of like ordered into existence, planned into existence in the government theory versus the spontaneous order theory.
That's right, and you know, it also matters in terms of how new currencies will get introduced. And so if we think back about those fiat monies versus the commodity monies, the thing about commodity monies is that they have some non-monetary use. And so since people consume these commodities, they're already being traded, and so they're candidates in the Mengerian theory for potential monies. Fiat monies, on the other hand, when a fiat money is introduced, it's not accepted by anyone initially. It's because no one uses it, and it has no use aside from its role as money, and so at least initially no one's using it as a money. And so there becomes a bit of a puzzle from a Mengerian perspective about how these fiat monies get introduced.
Now, I mean, this is has important implications, therefore, for discussions about monetary reform or how you go about establishing a new currency. I mean, today our U.S. dollar is a pure fiat money, but it was, when it was introduced, it was convertible into gold. So I mean, it was not like introduced as a completely fiat money, right?
Right. So Ludwig von Mises, who was working in the tradition of Karl Menger, effectively put forward an argument that said that all monies have to have a historical link to some commodity in order for them to be valuable today. And so with something like the dollar, right, where redemption was taken away, that link is very clear. It used to have a commodity backing, and today it doesn't, but it has a historical link. For new monies proposed, so some recent monies that have been introduced, so the Somaliland shilling and the South Sudanese pound, and perhaps the more familiar example was the euro. These are fiat monies that have been introduced recently, and they don't seem to have a clear connection to some historical commodity, at least on the surface, because they were never redeemable for some commodity.
Right.
But in fact, if you look at how those currencies were introduced, initially they're introduced at a fixed exchange rate with currencies that are already circulating. And so if those currencies that were already circulating were either introduced at a fixed exchange rate with currencies before that, or had some historical link to some commodity, we can see that through the down the chain of monies, at some point there is some historical link to these commodities. And so
so in particular, in the case of the euro, which I guess the euro coins and dollars or bills started circulating in 2002, it was actually introduced sort of gradually ahead of that, right?
That's right. So in 1999, the denomination of the euro, this as a unit of account, was introduced, and so all of these currencies in the eurozone began fixing their currencies, the value of their currencies, to the value of this unit of account, the euro. And then in 2002, the actual euro was introduced, and so it was introduced at a fixed exchange with all of the existing currencies. And so you can see there's a clear historical link there to what people were using before then. And again, across that those chains of money use over time, there's ultimately some connection to commodity monies.
And I would imagine that if a government wanted to try to introduce some fiat money and were completely ignorant of the history of how money came about, they might introduce something that wouldn't circulate at all, right?
That's right. So some governments have tried to introduce currencies without first providing this historical link through the fixed exchange, and those currencies have a very difficult time getting off the ground. And so oftentimes it's back to the drawing board, and they try again with a fixed exchange, and they are able to get them off the ground. Of course, once you get them off the ground, you can lose the fixed exchange rate, and that's what's happened with the euro and the Somaliland shilling and the South Sudanese pound are recent examples.
In addition to like the euro, probably even more recently and more, I guess, ultimately possibly innovative was the emergence of something called Bitcoin, a cryptocurrency.
Yeah.
And tell us a little bit about what Bitcoin is about.
Yeah, so Bitcoin is an unbacked digital currency, and so on the one hand it looks a lot like dollars or euros. It doesn't have some commodity basis, It's only worth what people are willing to hand over for it, and it's only useful if it's useful as a medium of exchange. And yet, it has a positive value. Today it trades for around $275 for a Bitcoin. And so there's a real question about how this peculiar digital currency got off the ground, right? It seems that at least one plausible explanation is that it started in very small groups, and those very small groups were able to coordinate. And once it had some circulation in that very small group, then it could support some circulation in a somewhat larger group. And so you get this emergence of an unbacked money that in some extent resembles the emergence of commodity monies, but to some extent is very different as well.
Because it has no, like you said, it has no underlying commodity value, and it doesn't really actually exist. It's like it's a true electronic money.
That's right. It's just a digital currency, and so and those digital balances are only useful if people are going to be exchanging with them. Unlike something like gold or salt that has some use apart from its role in exchange.
But Bitcoin is starting to be accepted by some merchants, right? So it is starting to serve as a medium of exchange.
That's right, some very large merchants even. And so Overstock.com accepts Bitcoin. And in fact, there are some intermediaries like Coinbase and Zappo, which have developed some technology where you can accept Bitcoin without even receiving Bitcoin. And so they'll receive it on your behalf and exchange it into dollars or whatever currency you want to use. So that makes it much easier to build a network of Bitcoin users.
Whereas Bitcoin has some uses beyond simply necessarily as money. It is a way to conduct some transactions that might otherwise not occur in our, because although we have a very extensive international financial system, not everybody's connected to it, and some of those costs are high.
That's right. And so for some people around the world, Bitcoin provides a means of payment that they wouldn't have access in the absence of something like Bitcoin, and other people can be confident that when they receive that balance that the transaction won't be reversed by a corrupt bank or a corrupt government. They can be secure that those transactions, once made, are final, and so that potentially facilitates exchange.
And some merchants prefer using Bitcoin to the credit cards because it costs less.
That's right. So the way in which Bitcoin processes transactions might be cheaper than the way that traditional merchant accounts process transactions. And so whereas credit cards, when you swipe at a merchant account, charges perhaps between 2% and 6%, a company like Coinbase will process your Bitcoin transaction for just 1%. And so some people want to accept, some businesses want to accept it for the lower fees.
Well, this has been a very interesting discussion. Any final thoughts? Do you think Bitcoin is going to replace money?
Well, it's always a question of to what degree, right? I'm a little bearish on Bitcoin. I don't think that it's going to replace the dollar or anything like that. But I do think it raises some interesting questions, and certainly it gets us thinking about monetary alternatives. And so I think that's a good thing.
Well, thanks very much, Will, and thank you for joining us. Join us again next time for another EconVersations.